You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mátyás Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinek.hu/en.
Welcome everyone to the MCC GeoPod podcast. I am Máté Vigóczki. I'm an expert on Russia at MCC's Center for Geopolitics. Today's broadcast is about Afghanistan and Central Asia, based on the experience of an expert who knows the region very well. Our guest is Dr. Sergej Andrejev, an expert on the Middle East and Central Asia, who not only researches the region, but has also done extremely rare and valuable fieldwork in Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iran, and Sudan in various UN missions. Dear Sergej, before we assess the situation in 1 year after the withdrawal of the US troops and the unexpectedly rapid return of the Taliban, could you please briefly tell us about your professional experience in Afghanistan?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Vigóczki. It's really a pleasure to be invited to do this podcast. Well, I have been doing Afghan studies since basically 1981. On an academic side first, and I was particularly interested in establishing certain sort of pervasive patterns running through the Afghan history, though I am perfectly aware that it's now considered a deadly sin to talk of primordial features and sort of continuation in the history of any given country. But it depends on the nature of the society, and the Afghan society is usually described as the traditional one. That's why you can identify certain patterns running throughout Afghan history since early modern times until basically now. I also not only an academic, I also worked in Afghanistan for the UN, for some NGOs and other basically organizations. I traveled throughout the country extensively during the Taliban time, right after the demise of the Taliban. I visited some pretty exotic places like Nuristan, for example, or Munjan. And in Nuristan, I was even given a very sort of elevated level of hospitality. They staged a parade of tribal militia in my honor, and then the gentleman in command of this tribal militia reported to me, and I sort of took the honor of accepting his report and congratulating these tribal fighters with their military prowess. So yes, I basically know the country in and out, and I also speak both of the main Afghan languages, that is Dari and Pashto.
If I would ask you to assess the situation 1 year after, last August the Taliban took control of the country with unexpected speed. This put an end to 20 years of Western attempts to state buildings. How successful do you see the Taliban in running the country right now? How much does it control the whole territory of Afghanistan? And perhaps more importantly for us, how real are the fears that they will or they can radicalize again?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll answer your questions in reverse order. It's just easier for me to remember it, starting basically from the last. Well, you phrased your question, fears that the Taliban will radicalize. They have been radicalized from the very moment of their inception in mid-90s, and they remained like that, and it's most likely that they will remain pretty radicalized for foreseeable future. Because they derive their legitimacy basically from their very radical interpretation of Islam and how the country should be run. So yes, they are these typical radical Islamist jihadists, if you like. What distinguishes them from the international kind of jihadism is that they're extremely parochial. They are concerned with their country only. However, it's an uneasy marriage of convenience between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And as you know, it was used as a pretext for the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in the early 21st century after these tragic events of 9/11. And there was a misconception always about the relations between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But anyone with knowledge of Afghan history and how Afghan society basically works, especially the Pashtun segment of the Afghan society, which is tribal, would know that it was basically patron-client relationship between the Pashtuns, tribal Pashtuns, and Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda are foreigners primarily. They are not exactly embedded in the Pashtun tribal society, and that's why they can survive only as clients. With that in mind, it was absolutely sort of absurd to demand of the Taliban to give up the Al-Qaeda people and any sort of association with Al-Qaeda. Because to betray your client will result in the loss of honor, not just personal honor, but also sort of tribal honor, ethnic honor, if you like. And if you do that, you basically commit a political suicide. And you will be expelled from all sort of tribal institutions, tribal structures, and without a tribe, you cannot survive. There is an Afghan saying that says basically volumes about this situation. Bad kaum bashi, bi kaum na bashi, which basically translates, it's better to belong to a bad tribe than not to belong to any tribe at all. Well, I have to apologize for all this terminology, but I find it excruciating basically to dispense with the gobbledygook, so you will forgive me for that. Yes, and then your first question, how the... sorry, I haven't yet finished with answering the second question. So Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Yes, so they are under ideological influence of Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda, as we all know, is basically an internationalist movement. They have sort of global aspirations and ambitions, so it's most likely they will nudge the Taliban towards sort of a more global agenda. And there are some pretty worrying indicators already emerging. Like a few weeks ago, some pretty high-ranking Al-Qaeda members were appointed to the Taliban government. It's not the top brass positions, rather mid-ranking, but still there is a worrying trend that Al-Qaeda is basically penetrating the Taliban governance structures in official capacity. So there will be a certain contradictory trends in this alliance between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The Taliban would like to limit their activities to Afghanistan only, while Al-Qaeda is hell-bent on promoting the global Islamist and jihadist agenda. Well, how successful they are in controlling the country, it's a paradox of Afghan history. It's very easy to capture the country, but basically impossible to conquer and control it. It has been the case not only with numerous foreign invaders, starting from, the British, then the Soviets, then the US-led coalition. It's also the case with any incarnation, iteration of the Afghan government. No Afghan government has ever controlled the entire country. Afghan politics, they develop on the local village level. It's highly localized. And the national agenda is of no particular importance for those who really run the show, and these actors are very well pronounced on the local level, community level. So yes, the Taliban managed to capture the country with lightning speed, basically because the government, the President Ghani government, not to mention the foreign forces, were considered as illegitimate by the bulk of the Afghan population, simply because the foreigners, they were not Muslims, and Afghans do not like foreign troops on their territory. And the Kabul government, it was seen as basically puppets of the West, not exactly in touch with the local population, with the people at the village level, and basically as those who betrayed their Afghan identity, because they were described by a pretty derogatory appellation, necktie, which basically a corrupted version of the English necktie, and no Afghan would ever think of wearing this Western piece of clothes, tie, because it's associated with the cross. And the Taliban, before their demise, a few months before the Western intervention, they explicitly banned wearing ties in Afghanistan. And many international civil servants, your most obedient servant included, had the audacity of making a case of wearing the necktie, even in the situations when it was not exactly required by the rules of protocol or panache. So just to annoy the bloody Taliban. So we were extremely nasty towards them, I must admit. So what is happening now? The Taliban, they control the bulk of the country, but there is an armed opposition towards their rule, Jabhat Muqawamat, which stands for Resistance France. It's based in Panjshir. And Panjshir, as you know, is the Tajik-populated area, very treacherous in terms of terrain, and is the home place of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the great guerrilla fighter who was pretty successfully fighting first against the Soviets, then against the Taliban, and he was killed by Al-Qaeda operatives 2 days before 9/11. So his son, whose name is Ahmad Massoud, he is now in charge of this resistance front. They claim some military successes against the Taliban. And then there are also some other pockets of resistance, first of all in Hazarajat, because the Hazara people, they are not Sunni Muslims, they are Shia and Ismaili Muslims. And there is also a racial element here, because they are very much Mongoloid, and because of their sort of racial features as well as because of their religion, they was always looked down by the mainstream Afghans, especially the Pashtuns. So, and there are some talks of mergence between the Massoud-led resistance front and these armed opposition Hazara groups. There are also some reports of fighting between the Pashtun and the Tajik and Uzbek Taliban in the north of the country. The only chance of survival for the Taliban is if they do not interfere with tribal politics, tribal way of life, and different ethnic groups' way of life, because not Afghans are tribal, it's just the Pashtuns. The Northerners, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, they are non-tribal. and they basically follow this Chingizid pattern of governance as opposed to the tribal one of the Pashtun South. But the Taliban cannot do it because if they abandon their Islamist agenda and an attempt to impose certain rules and guidelines very different from the tribal way of life, they will lose any legitimacy and they will not be seen as proper Islamists, jihadis who expelled the foreigners and who should now basically follow the Islamic patterns. However, if they start to implement their Islamist agenda, they will inevitably antagonize the tribes, like it was the case in 2001, because why it was so easy to capture Afghanistan. And basically, as many people hoped at the time, consigned the Taliban to the dustbin of history, because the tribes were disillusioned with their rule and their harsh attempts to impose non-tribal ways of governance on pretty independent-minded tribes. And also bribing helps. One tribe, $1 million. So basically, it cost the United States $350 million to buy all of the tribes. Another problem the Taliban will face, and like it was also the case with all other incarnations of Afghan governments, is that Afghanistan is a rentier state. It survives in a low production economy environment, and until recently, 45% of state budget was funded by international aid. And it has been like that since the late 19th century. The rule of Emir Abdurrahman, who was heavily subsidized by the British, who basically bankrolled the expansion of his power to northern Afghanistan. Then it continued like that with the only interruption in the early, all of the 90s when the Soviets withdrew. It was done with the Najibullah government. First the Mujahideen ruled the country, then the Taliban took over, and it was basically decided by the international community that this poor country is of no importance. And we all know what happened in 90s in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan cannot survive without a foreign sponsor. It looks unlikely that the international community, or in any sort of shape or shade of its members, is prepared to bankroll the Taliban regime. So the only option left for them is to look for an alternative sponsor, and that should be a non-state actor. And the most likely candidate for that is basically international jihadists. It's Al-Qaeda. Islamic State is unlikely because now the Taliban is fighting against the Islamic State. And for the time being, there appears no room for accommodating each other, but Al-Qaeda is the prime candidate, and they're also a pretty wealthy and large pool of individuals, especially in the Gulf states, who may be prepared to extend a helping hand to the Taliban and basically help them financially and logistically. The implications are quite clear. Afghanistan will again prove a safe haven for all these untoward militant elements, like it was in the 90s. And all these international sponsors will be pushing the Taliban towards a more sort of internationalist, more aggressive jihadist agenda, not just limiting their activities to their homeland.
So you mentioned that the Taliban has legitimacy, and this is their biggest pros compared to the Westerns. How do you see the current situation of the Taliban is it possible that they will lose somehow this legitimacy, or they just have to stick the tribal structure of the Afghan state and find some financial support outside of the country?
Well, they will definitely lose their legitimacy if they start interfering with tribal affairs and tribal way of life and tribal way of ruling the different localities. At the same time, they will find it extremely difficult to provide any services associated with any government in any country, simply because they do not have any money, unless they find a very generous sponsor. So they'll find themselves between the rock and the hard place. How they're going to deal with it? Yes, well, there is one way of doing it, basically whipping up the religious fervor. It may help in a short perspective, but in the long run, it's unlikely that they can sustain this jihadist enthusiasm for a very long time.
And looking at Afghanistan from the West, there is also another fear, which is if there would be an anarchy in Afghanistan, probably Russia or China would intervene. Is there any possibility for doing so, or this is also just a fear looking from the West and absolutely not true?
Well, I would say that neither Russia nor China can be that stupid. I hope they started learning Afghan history and they could have seen that any foreign attempt to mess up with the country ends up in a rather embarrassing imbroglio. Apart from that, what would be the desired end state either for Russia or China in Afghanistan? What, demise of the Taliban and sort of fragmentation of the country? Why find the Taliban? And it's basically not just the Russian approach. If you look at what the West is doing, there is absolutely no encouragement from Western actors towards this Jabhat Muqawimat, the resistance front. Recent meeting between representatives of the front and Mr. West, who is the special U.S. representative for Afghanistan, sent a very discouraging message to this resistance front. Basically, well, try to find some accommodation with the Taliban. We are in no way going to support you. So now, basically, the only country that still sort of explicitly supports the resistance front is Tajikistan. But Tajikistan is too poor and has too limited resources to play decisive hand in this pretty complex Afghan game.
If you mentioned Tajikistan, I would like to highlight that this country is next door to Afghanistan, and it is a member of CSTO. Therefore, it is very important for Moscow. It is an extremely poor country which is highly dependent on the Russian economy. And how do you see, is there a real risk that the situation could develop in Afghanistan that would endanger the stability in Tajikistan? Or saying it in another way, could there be any domino effect that could destabilize the whole central region, starting from Afghanistan and then Tajikistan and so on?
If you're talking about domino effect, there is no equivalent of the Taliban in Central Asia. Yes, there are some radical Islamists. They have been marginalized, jailed, or driven into exile by Central Asian authorities. They may still have some sleeper cells in Central Asia. But for the time being, they are a spent force when we are talking sort of in situ in Central Asia. So they all moved to Afghanistan, which provides them a safe haven, and provided the Afghanistan followed the friendly advice of the international jihadist sponsors and assume a more globalized agenda. Apart from providing refuge for all the Central Asian and Chinese jihadists, they may basically provide them with some help and incentives to move across the Amudarya River and start some military activities in Central Asia as such. That also includes Tajikistan. I do not see any, for the time being only, of course, I do not see any sort of fertile ground in Central Asia for a mass Islamist uprising similar to that of the Taliban, unless the governments there do something extremely unwise and really antagonize the population. Yes, in terms of economic well-being of Central Asia, as you all know, the remittances from Central Asian labor migrants in Russia provide a gargantuan chunk of income for these pretty poor countries. Provided the Russian economy contracts, there will be less jobs for these Central Asian migrants, less money going back home, more people coming back from Russia to Central Asia, and that also may fuel the rather precarious economic situation there. But in terms of domino effect, I think it's rather unfortunate choice of terminology because, as I said, there is no Taliban equivalent in Central Asia. The only danger is the internal root causes in Central Asia, like repressive governance regime and economic difficulties connected with all these problems with finding jobs in Russia. And yes, that may provide certain opportunities for these jihadist elements who are based in Afghanistan, provided they are incited by the Taliban to move across the river and basically do something pretty spectacular there. But it will be not the domino effect.
And for a last question, please answer me shortly. How do you see the future in 1 year in Afghanistan and in the region if there will be no Black Swan event?
I cannot see any crystal ball in the studio to stare in and tell you the future. I can only, if I try to act professionally, I can only give you probabilities and do this alternative future analysis pretty quickly. So we can identify different drivers, namely radicalization of the Taliban and fragmentation of the country. Radicalization will be implemented in case they find these international sponsors. On the bottom of this driver, no international sponsor, then fragmentation of the country. On top of this driver, plenty of international support, continuing radicalization, internal and external, inward-looking and outward-looking, which will undermine the tribal governance mechanisms, which will again antagonize the bulk of Afghan population, so they will find themselves in a pretty precarious position. So I cannot predict that they are going to enjoy stability, that they're going to form a working form of government. So the choice is basically between fragmentation and increasing radicalization of the Taliban, which in turn leads to an increasing danger of the country's fragmentation.
Dear Sergej, thank you so much for being here and to help us to understand the realities in Afghanistan and in the region 1 year after the withdrawal of the Western troops.
Yes, you're most welcome. Thank you for inviting me to share my humble thoughts with the audience.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinek.hu/en.